They told us the dead zones were natural, places where matter forgot to gather, where stars simply never learned how to burn. That was the bedtime story. The truth floated in the shadow of Kepler 186f, a silhouette longer than a city and darker than the vacuum around it. Captain Nix Tal pressed her palm to the viewport of the prospecting cutter Ardent Dawn and felt the ship's bones hum, like a throat trying not to scream. "Contact, bearing 09, clicked Thel, her faceted-eyed sensor chief. "Mass anomaly, rectilinear, artificial. Nix's crest changed color, an involuntary tell her species never evolved out of. Bring us in slow, shields up, salvage teams warm." 12 species served aboard her ship because Discovery paid well and paid fairly. They wanted ore, relics, anything to keep the engines fed. None of them wanted to find a legend. They found it anyway. The object turned as if embarrassed to be seen. Armor plates scarred by impacts looked like continents on a globe. Along the hull, letters repeated, a script no database could read, yet arranged with human stubbornness. UNS Long Vigil. The designation shouldn't have meant anything. In nursery myths, the humans were a punchline, boastful phantoms who went extinct before the galaxy grew teeth. "Age?" Nix asked. Aloran, the gray, slow-speaking science officer, exhaled. "Radiation pitting suggests hundreds of millennia. Gravity grid still whispering. This vessel refuses to die." Refusal was a human word. Nix felt it fit. They matched rotation, clamped airlocks, and stepped into a corridor sized for giants. Their suit lamps climbed walls etched with gouges like claw marks, then slid over memorial plates. Names. Millions of them. Not carved to inspire, but to remember. Something in Nix's chest tightened. The knowledge that you etched names that way when you expected no one to visit again. "Power traces forward," Thel said. "Computer core, secondary life support lingering." The core blossomed under Moru's 4 deft hands. Interfaces were shattered, but whoever built this ship planned for insults. Aloran coaxed a dying lattice awake. Holograms crawled across the dark. Starfields marked with crimson circles, then blacked out entirely. Formations of ships converging on geometries that made no sense. Figures with 2 arms and 2 legs, faces broad and blunt and startlingly expressive. Humans. They wore insignia stamped with an older symbol of Earth. They looked tired in a way war teaches. A woman's recording flickered. Her scalp was shaved. Her left eye was metal. "If you're seeing this," she said, "we didn't make it back to Bastion 9. Doesn't matter. Hold the line." The translation program stumbled, then found her cadence. "If the line has fallen, then you must learn fast." "Learn what?" Nix asked the air. The answer was not a word, but a map blacked into nothing. Aloran whispered, "The dead zones are footprints." Something stepped and reality left dents. The corridor groaned as if the ship acknowledged the confession. Then Thel's frill snapped flat. "Captain, I'm reading a heat bloom, medical bay, 1 stasis signature. A survivor, after an epoch. Ethics outweighed salvage in 1 heartbeat." They cut through a bow door and entered a chamber crowded with inert pods. Only one still glowed, its glass latticed with frost, its machinery cycling between hope and exhaustion. Nix laid her gloved palm on the casing. Inside floated a human, mid-aged, scars like punctuation across her arms, a webwork of ports along her spine. Her chest moved once every minute, a life on a knife edge. "Protocol?" Moru asked. Nix looked at the names on the wall, then at the woman inside. "We wake her," she said, "and we ask her what taught a ship to refuse death." As the pod warmed, Alarms whimpered, ancient systems complaining at being dragged from the grave. The human's eyes snapped open, red cybernetic iris dilating like a small sun. She tore the breather from her mouth on instinct and crouched with a mechanic's wrench held like a knife. "Identify," she rasped. The translator needed 2 tries, then echoed her threat with crisp vowels. "Are you null?" Nix opened both hands. "Explorers, we found your ship. We come from 100 worlds that believe in leaving places better than we found them." The human listened, that ferocious, measuring listening of someone who has counted too many last chances. Slowly, she lowered the wrench. "Commander Alara Quinn," she said, "United Terran Fleet, serial QS-14-777. If I'm awake after this long, then either the war is over or it followed me." In the far bulkheads, the long vigil's remaining lights answered with a flicker like the start of a storm. They brought Commander Quinn to the Ardent Dawn's infirmary, and for a day she slept like a collapsed star. When she woke, Nix was there with water, a translator patch, and questions too large for any one throat. "What are the null?" Nix asked softly. Quinn's cybernetic eye focused as if it had to relearn depth. "Not a species," she said, voice gone steadier, "a consequence. We called them the nullborn. They don't invade with ships. They enter where the math phrase, borderlands of physics, edges of thought. They eat categories, planet, person, promise. When they finish a meal, even the word that described it tastes wrong." Aloran's skin blanched. That would explain the ragged metrics of emptiness. Quinn tapped the scar by her temple. "We discovered early that you can't fight a metaphor with metal alone. Our shields failed because shields presume there will be something to block. The null unmake the there, so we built anchors, devices that tell reality very loudly to keep itself together." Moru leaned forward. "Specifications. Your engines can write them," Quinn said, "if your engineers are willing to learn new grammar." She smiled, brittle and human. "I will teach you what we learned in 1,000 bitter classrooms." Nix took her to the Long Vigil's archive. The core's redundancy was fanatical, hardened coils nested inside coffins of alloy. Quinn's handprint, half flesh, half machine, unlocked a cascade of ghost light. Tactical logs stitched centuries into patterns, memorials cross-referenced with campaigns, research notes annotated by soldiers who had learned to sketch equations with burned fingers. Nix understood none of it, but she recognized devotion, the kind you usually reserve for music or children. "The first lesson," Quinn said, walking them through a holographic atlas of absence, "is evacuation. We thought courage meant standing. It also means moving everyone who can't. The second lesson is language. The null listen for certainty. Swear with care. Don't name a fixed future unless your anchors can carry the load." "Are you asking us to doubt?" Thel bristled. "I'm asking you to be precise," Quinn replied. "Humility isn't surrender, it's engineering." They watched battles recorded from perspectives that made Nix's stomach tilt. Destroyers knitting webs of axioms, carriers spooling out drones that sang numeric hymns to keep local causality awake, boarding teams locking their minds to a common proof. The images were terrifying, yes. But between the detonations and the screaming geometry, Nix saw faces laughing in mess halls, a mural painted on a bulkhead, blue oceans and children with kites, a handwritten sign above a hatch, "If you find this, you are home enough to rest." "Why fight alone?" Aloran asked. "Why not ask the galaxy?" Quinn flinched. "We did. Once. The first coalition we brought to the rim vanished so completely their homeworlds grew forests where their cities had been. We decided one species was a fairer price than all. Some of us called that arrogance. Some called it love. Most of us called it math. Nyx felt the words fall into a place in her chest she kept for promises. You believed one hurt could spare 1,000,000. We believed we could carry it, Quinn said. We were wrong and right in cycles. She lifted a roll of bad jokes printed on brittle film, smiled in a way that reached past the machine in her eye. We stored music, too, not because it wins battles, because it reminds the victors who they were before they sharpened themselves. A tremor slid through the long vigil like a remembered pain. Thell's console pinged. Captain, long-range gravimetrics just twitched. Quinn went still. They found us. Maybe an old feedback, Moru offered. Quinn shook her head. Endurance teaches superstition, but also pattern recognition. That signature looks like a null scout nibbling the seams. They test first, then they eat. Nyx looked at the plates of names, at the stripe of frost still melting down the stasis pod, at her crew who had come out to get rich and had found a ledger with columns labeled meaning and debt. We can run, she said, forcing the word to be honest, or we can go tell the ones with bigger ships and smaller imaginations. Your council will argue, Quinn said. They will be offended at the grammar of survival. Some will call me myth. Some will want to dissect me to prove I am real. She looked at Nyx. Find the ones who will listen first. Even one fleet fitted with anchors can be a hinge. And you? Nyx asked. Quinn glanced toward the memorial wall. I promised a ship I would carry her story back across the dark. A promise is a kind of anchor. Let me help you make good on both. They broke docking, the long vigil left to drift like a tomb that had finally confessed. The ardent dawn burned for council space with a new kind of cargo. A teacher who looked like a weapon, an archive that sounded like grief, and a captain determined to turn a bedtime story into a battle plan. The Council of Concordance had never smelled fear before. It was a stadium of marble acoustics and polite applause. On the day the ardent dawn translated in, the air tasted metallic. News had spread faster than ships. Surveyors had dragged a myth into the light, and the myth wanted the microphone. Nyx stood at the podium with Quinn at her side. She had rehearsed a thesis. She delivered a confession. We found a ship named the Long Vigil, she began. Screens above her head unfolded starfields like linen. We found an archive that says the dead zones are not empty by accident. We woke a soldier who fought so long she built a metronome out of her heartbeat. The first ambassador to stand was lacquered in authority. We have models that explain vacuums. Keep them, Quinn said. Her voice did not need amplification. Also build anchors. You can believe two things at once until one of them starts eating the other. Laughter rippled, then the recordings began. No one laughed again. They watched battles where light hesitated. They saw a corvette survive by stating in engine-rending harmonics that it existed. They saw a hospital ship vanish between frames, leaving behind a child's drawing of her family taped to a bulkhead. They read strings of names too long for any throat. When the lights returned, the room had shrunk around the silence. We are explorers, said the ambassador of glass. We will not become monsters. Quinn rolled up her sleeve. Metal flexed where flesh had given up. Monsters forget why they sharpened themselves. We never forgot. She nodded toward Nyx. Tell them what you told me when we left the vigil. Nyx steadied her crest. Our proverbs say, if a bridge must burn, light it so others can see. I don't want to burn, but if the only other option is letting the whole horizon go dark, give me the torch and a teacher. The vote was not immediate. It was hours of tradition resisting terror. Some delegates demanded peer review before policy. Some accused Quinn of psychological warfare. One suggested surrender. If there was a mouth, perhaps it could be fed treaties. Aloran patiently explained that you cannot negotiate with a subtraction sign. They broke for respite. Nix found Quinn in a quiet gallery overlooking the docking arms. Beyond the glass, freighters made bright threads of intent. "How many times did your people argue like this?" Nix asked. "Every time we bled," Quinn said. "Democracy is a conscience you have to carry even when you're sprinting." She reached up and adjusted the translator patch. "We kept historians on staff. They reminded us that republics die when they confuse urgency with permission." Nix smiled. "You keep saying things that are going to end up in school books." "Good," Quinn said. "Write them in pencil, the null like erasers." The council reconvened. This time, the ones who build things spoke. Harbor masters who knew tide tables better than myths, engineers whose hands remembered hot metal, medics who had learned that triage is a kind of love. They asked Quinn for schematics and Nix for logistics. They proposed an interim fitment, anchors for exploration hulls, training for crews most likely to meet the edge first, doctrine that taught doubt as a tool and courage as a verb. The vote passed by 3. Not a flood of faith, but a hinge. Training began at once. Ardent Dawn became a classroom. Moru and Quinn argued as if the future had ears, and it did. Thel taught sensor teams how to hear the wrongness at the seam of real. Aloran chaired a language committee that rewrote emergency protocols to avoid promises physics could punish. "Say we will try, not we will be there," he said, and ambassadors flinched at the humility. Anchors hummed to life in test bays. Early units shattered under their own certainty. Later ones flexed. A cadet passed out, then woke laughing, saying she had dreamt of being a theorem. Nix remembered the mural on the long vigil and ordered every mess deck to hang something painted by someone not being paid to paint. 3 weeks into drills, alarms cut the station's night in half. A mining relay went dark. A rescue corvette launched. It did not come back. Telemetry recorded nothing, a clean gap where a life had been. In the council chamber, the ambassador of glass covered her mouth with both hands. "How close?" she whispered. "Too close," Thel said, "and getting closer." Quinn's eye brightened, not with delight but with decision. "You don't win by waiting for the null to choose the battlefield," she said. "You win by meeting them at the seam and teaching the seam new manners." Nix turned to the assembled captains. "You wanted proof. It is eating your relays. You wanted time. It is a predator that hunts clocks. We have anchors. We have doctrine. We have a choice." In the hangar bays, ships began to power up. Engines sang questions to space. The answers would be written in the grammar of survival. They named the task force Proof of Life because names matter. 11 hulls sortied, 6 exploration cutters with infant anchors, 3 patrol frigates whose captains were brave enough to admit fear in writing, 1 hospital ship, and the Ardent Dawn with Commander Quinn on its bridge. The vector toward the mining relay drew a line through reputable space that had never been taught to flinch. As they closed, the stars thinned, subtly wrong, as if a child had used a dull eraser. Anchors hummed, layered chords tuned to insist the universe remain a noun. "Reading gradient shear," Thel said, "like gravity but sideways." "Hold formation," Nix ordered. "Hosp ship centered. We're not heroes, we're a hypothesis." At the relay's coordinates they found nothing. Not wreckage, not heat, not regret. Quinn stared into an absence with the familiarity of someone recognizing the empty chair at a family table. "They're tasting," she said. "They'll pull harder unless we push." "Weapons?" asked Patrol 3. "Not yet," Quinn said. "First you introduce yourself." She keyed the anchor grid to broadcast a simple assertion engines could sing, "We are here." Hulls resonated, the smudged dark ahead of them wrinkled, offended. Response, Thel whispered. A shape appeared, less a vessel than a possibility, a region where vectors curved toward silence. It refracted pings into non-answers. It tasted like forgetting. "Now weapons," Quinn said. "Fire the question." Moru's first-generation ordnance did not explode. It performed a proof, reiterating local laws loud enough to bruise whatever denied them. The first volley struck, the dark receded like a flinch. The second made it shiver. The third taught it a new word, no. It collapsed into glittering wrong angles that evaporated, leaving a pressure headache. "Did we?" Thel began. "Win?" "No," Quinn said. "We shooed away a scout. Scouts gossip." She turned to Nyx. "We need a beacon, a standing hymn, not a flare. Build an anchor here that sings even when we sleep." "Council will balk at the cost," Aloran murmured. "Then tell them the budget line item is continuing to exist," Quinn replied. They laid the foundation for a fixed anchor, arrays interlinked across nothing, insisting a something. Engineers worked with careful impatience. The hospital ship's chaplain, an old amphibian with a baker's hands, moved through the bays murmuring blessings. Nyx took breaks in an observation blister. Quinn joined her, sipping tea like a ritual rediscovered. "How did you keep your people human?" Nyx asked. "After so long becoming knives." "We made holidays," Quinn said, "even at the rim. We told jokes only funny because we were alive to tell them. We wrote letters to children who hadn't been born, then stored them in vaults labeled open if we win." The anchor lit, a low, immense chord. Space around the relay snapped back into place with an audible relief. The scopes filled again with ordinary stars, an ordinary emptiness that suddenly felt like wealth. It lasted 9 minutes. Then the dark folded in on itself and opened like a wound. The thing that came through did not scout, it declared. Where it moved, constellations hiccuped. Where it looked, names thinned. The anchor throbbed, bent, and held barely. Alarms wrote red calligraphy across every panel. "Formation Gamma," Nyx snapped. "Hosp ship backline, frigates Harry. Proof ordnance Ripple, not salvo. We're not trying to kill the sea, we're trying to keep our boat real." The first exchange taught them humility. Patrol 2 inverted not physically but semantically. Its transponder began broadcasting a version of itself that had never launched. The crew's screams came as questions. Were we ever? The anchor's cord rose, the frigate re-threaded. Their questions turned into swearing. They lived. The lesson cost them something nameless. Quinn's hand hovered, then landed. "Authorization Echo," she said. "We go loud." Nyx hesitated, one heartbeat, the kind that defines leadership. Then she nodded. Echo granted. The ardent dawn's secondary grid woke, a lattice of borrowed equations Quinn had tuned like an old violin. The ship sang 3 statements at once. "We are here. We are many. We are worth the math." The wound hesitated. For the first time it looked uncertain. "Fire the 4th," Quinn whispered. "What 4th?" Moru asked. "History." Quinn opened a channel across all bands and played a recording she had carried in the long vigil's black box for half an era. Music. Not fancy, an earth lullaby about sailing home. The melody braided with the anchor's cord. On screens, the null's edge frayed. In sickbay, the chaplain laughed through tears and went to bake because that is what he did when terror passed close enough to warm his hands. The thing withdrew, not defeated but denied an easy meal. Anchors hummed. Crews exhaled. In the quiet after, the hospital ship reported 2 births, and someone wrote the babies' names on the new anchor's casing in grease pencil. Back at Concordance, the council did not argue about budgets. They argued about scale. The seam had met resistance and would return with teeth. They needed doctrine, shipyards, teachers. Nix looked at Quinn and understood the road ahead. Not a sprint, not a siege, but a relay. You carry the torch until your hands blister. Then you pass it. Then you teach the next pair of hands to blister more gracefully. The night after Proof of Life returned, the Concordance didn't sleep. You can't sleep after watching a wound in the sky hesitate because a ship sang a lullaby. Workshops overflowed. The language committee published a draft grammar of survival that fit on a single page and hurt to read. Say only what you can carry. Promise only what you can anchor. Doubt is a tool. Use it cleanly. The council voted a slate of acts with names so plain they felt like prayers. The anchor accords. The right to refuse, the right to remember. Quinn insisted on the accords. If you sharpen a population without consent, you are the monster you fear, she told jurists, her mechanical eye dim to avoid intimidating the gallery. The law they wrote required 3 signatures for any permanent modification: the person, a physician, and an ethicist with no stake in the outcome. Anchors would be audited like banks and blessed like bridges. Every armory would fund a library. Every combat school would fund a kitchen. You can't defend existence if you forget what it's for, Nix said, and a budget line item appeared for music. Thel taught wrongness recognition to cadets who had grown up with star maps and bedtime myths. He pinned up still frames from the relay, constellations with one star subtly thinner, shadows a half-degree off. It feels like embarrassment, he told them. The universe trying to cover a bruise. Aloran turned his office into a civic classroom. He spoke of republics that survived because they counted votes during thunderstorms and armies that failed because they mistook their slogans for strategies. Precision, he said, chalk clicking, is not a style choice. It is mercy. Shipyards woke. Anchors grew from crates into cathedrals, interlaced rings of matter and meaning, tuned to hum the ordinary back into stubbornness. The design Thel favored looked like a circle of hands. Moru's favorite looked like an oven. Because the chaplain bakes when the world shakes, he said, sketching. A kitchen is where you go to be reminded you're a person, not a problem set. Quinn grinned. We called some of ours basilicas, she said. Yours can be bakeries, just make them hold. They planned an array, 12 major anchors at seams the long vigil had mapped, with smaller beacons filling the gaps. The Basilica Network, the press called it, because citizens prefer stained glass to equations. Opposition did not vanish. A block of delegates argued for evacuation to the galactic core, for quietness, for prayer without praxis. We have families, one said. You are asking us to become machinery. Quinn answered with a photograph from the vigil's archive, a child's drawing of 3 stick figures holding hands beneath a blue circle labeled Pizza Night. We kept this through sieges, she said. Becoming effective isn't the same as becoming empty. The first basilica rose at the relay like a lighthouse built out of verbs. Volunteers lined the halls with scraps of art, a stitched wave, a clay bird, a crude wooden bat whittled by a spacer who'd read about an old Earth game and wanted to feel the shape of play in her hands. On the naming day, 2 babies from the hospital ship slept through speeches and wailed during the anthem, as if to remind the dignitaries that life does not honor programs. The null noticed the array's scaffolding. They noticed the way language had begun to change on public feeds, verbs hedged, certainties calibrated. They noticed the council publishing mistakes and corrections in the same breath, and they adapted. Doubt blooms rippled through the network, not lies exactly, but misspecified questions seeded where confidence ran hot. If anchors insist on reality, are they tyrannical? If people sign consent forms under fear, is consent meaningful? If lullabies move machinery, are musicians weapons? The council did not censor. They debated on air with philosophers and mechanics and a baker who displayed exactly 3 burns and said, "Risk is not abuse. Bread is intentional harm to flour." Viewership spiked. Donations bought more ovens. Then came the notice from Deep Watch, a swell along the hollow current, a seam the vigil had marked as patient. It was no longer patient. The projection traced a line through the Aurora Gate, the busiest shipping throat in the quadrant, and straight toward Basilica 3, still half scaffold and prayer. Nick stared at the map while the room took turns being brave. "If the current cuts the gate," Aloran said, "supply to 8 worlds will stutter. Panic arrives before hunger. Panic eats laws." Thel brought up sensor math no one had time to admire. Moru tapped the oven anchor with a wrench and nodded to himself. Quinn touched the edge of the projection, a wartime superstition, and said, "We can't let them choose the metaphor again. We meet them there, we set the key, and we make the universe sing on our pitch." "Choir doctrine," Nick said, remembering the lullaby over the relay. "Call and response harmonics, improvisation within rule." Quinn began, stopped, then smiled at herself. "Let your musicians help your mathematicians. Don't turn the reverse into a religion." The next morning, the task order named Ardent Dawn as lead ship for Choir Group 1. The chaplain packed 4 pans. The ethics board signed 36 consent forms. Aloran wrote a letter to a student he'd never meet. "If you receive this, it means we did not lose our temper with the future." Nix read it twice and tucked it behind the bridge console. At departure, the station's loudspeakers played a mash of hymns and bar songs and nursery tunes. Engineers cried. Pilots pretended not to. Proof of life had proved the thing could be pushed. Now they would learn the cost of pushing harder. Aurora Gate shone like civilization, traffic in braided lanes, signals talking in courteous bursts, ships carrying ore and rice and wedding rings and books with dog-eared pages. As Choir Group 1 translated in, controllers cleared a bubble of space with a speed born from drills that assumed nothing, promised nothing, and saved lives anyway. The half-finished basilica hung like a rib cage waiting on a heart. "Choir check," Nix called. Voices chimed from 11 bridges. Alto, tenor, chitter, rumble. Reporting anchor hums and ordnance integrity and the sort of fear you confess so it doesn't trip you. Thel station filled with constellations annotated in stern handwriting. "This one is home to someone. This one too." The null arrived without ceremony, which is a ceremony. Space paled. Traffic feeds blinked where names had been. Green Olive Freight 77 read as green, and then as G, and then as nothing. The basilica groaned. Its unfinished rings tried to speak a full sentence with a mouth half-built. "We begin with law," Quinn said, palms flat, tone level as an oath. "Anchor chord in A, don't be precious about the letter, be ruthless about the timing." She nodded to the chaplain. He hit his oven switch. The harmonics of a warming coil braided into the grid. "People hear that as home," Quinn said. "So does reality." The first null vector pushed. It felt like a teacher crossing out a student's name too hard. The basilica's cord held. Patrol frigates fired proof torpedoes that wrote you are still you across local velocities. A freighter that had started to forget its cargo remembered oranges and burst into tears on an open channel. "Keep moving," Nix said, and a pilot said "I" like a prayer. The second push was cleverer. It slid between beats, sought the silences. A cutter's anchor slipped half a measure, and the ship began to broadcast its own eulogy, an automated loop carefully recorded just in case. The loop grew louder than the captain's voice. The crew froze, polite terror. Aloran's hand moved. He killed the feed and replaced it with a recitation. The names of the 2 babies born at the relay, the mass of the oven loaves, the number of bolts in the basilica's spine, specifics. The cutter's eulogy lost the argument and sulked itself quiet. Precision is mercy, Aloran told his console, and his console believed him. The null changed keys. The gate flickered. Whole lanes of traffic started listing destinations that had never been charted. Choir doctrine says, when your opponent takes your language, sing something older. Nix pointed at the chaplain. He started a round he had learned from a grandmother who swore she had not invented it. The crews of 11 ships found the harmony the way thirsty people find water. The basilica's rings brightened as if embarrassed they had doubted themselves. "See it," Thel cried. On his screen the null's contour kinked, a tiny arrogance exposed. It was sampling in fixed intervals, efficient, lazy, predictable. "We can syncopate," he said, already writing the pattern. Moru grunted approval, wired 2 capacitors together the way no manual sanctioned, and grinned like a thief with a moral argument. They punched on the off-beats. Proof torpedoes arrived in the rests. The null flinched for real this time, the kind of flinch muscle memory records. It responded with anger, which looks like hunger wearing speed. Basilica 3 thundered. A seam tore wider. A tendril reached for the Aurora Gate's main control node. If the node folded, lanes would tangle. Over 1,000 ships would become conditions rather than choices. "Keystone lock," Quinn said. "We need a mind inside the ring to hold the proof while the grid rethreads. Volunteers must have signed standing consent." "I have," Aloran said, and nobody argued because he'd been signing consent his whole life. To teach under pressure, to think under fire, to love a world that often forgot to write itself down. He strapped into the Keystone chair with the serenity of someone who knows the difference between calm and quiet. "If I get lost," he told Nix, "remind me of the babies' names." "Don't get lost," Nix said, which violated 3 lines of the grammar, and Aloran smiled like a man hearing a favorite mistake. He dove. The basilica's rings cascaded through him. He held the pattern the way a craftsman holds a plane, hands adjusting 1,000 times a second. Outside, null vectors clawed at the offbeats and found them slippery. Inside, Aloran recited teaspoons and birthdays and why it matters that laws require effort. The null tried to erase the word ought and got an aftertaste of neighbor. The tendril withdrew. The gate stabilized. Aloran exhaled a laugh that sounded like a grade entered in a ledger. "You're coming back," Nix ordered. "Soon," he said. "I need one more stitch." He made it and paid for it. When he stood, he was still Aloran, but something had been spent that no one could name. He walked slower. He took longer to find a noun. He asked Thel to repeat jokes. "Price," Quinn said quietly. "We should publish it." They did that night while cleaners scrubbed null residue off hulls and the chaplain burned a batch of bread because he was human enough to err. The council read the casualty list and the ledger of costs and for once refused to round. Basilica 3 finished the next week, hung with banners sewn by station children who didn't know they were designing medals. On the day they lit it fully, a transmission arrived on a band only the long vigil should have known. It was an old human encryption. It carried a voice with metal in it and laughter under that. Any vigil listening? The voice said, "This is Arc Perseverance. We heard someone singing our songs in a new accent. If you can hold the door, we can help you close it." Quinn set her tea down with hands that didn't shake. "Home didn't die," she said. "It got small. That is a kind of living." Arc Perseverance arrived like a rumor turning into a relative on your porch, smaller than legend, larger than grief. 219 humans lived aboard it, and none looked the same. Some had metal eyes that tracked like telescopes. Some had limbs that reconfigured to suit the tool. Some wore no visible augments at all and carried the quiet of practiced minds. They docked without ceremony. Ceremony is for people who don't owe the port their lives. On the concourse, Quinn met a woman older than any machine could explain. A face mapped by time, hair silvered where it still grew, hands clean despite work. "Archivist Hale," the woman said, "keeper of the cadence. I held the lullabies when the fleets fell apart." She held Quinn's gaze. "Commander, you carried your part of the song farther than we dreamed." Quinn swallowed 1,000 years. "We lost so much." "We lost people," Hale said. "We kept promises. One does not console the other. Both are true." They brought with them more than weapons. Closing argument, they called it. A proof designed to seal a tear and dismiss a null claim with prejudice. It required a network the Basilica Array could provide, a key the choir doctrine could sustain, and one constant the null would recognize as binding, a witness who had lived the war from its early proofs through its late improvisations. The closing argument must be spoken from the seam. Hale said, "It's a legal fiction with teeth. The court is cruel, but it respects a few old forms." Quinn looked at Nix across a table littered with schematics and bread crumbs. She knew where this pointed, so did Nix. Leadership is learning to hear the arrow in a sentence before anyone admits it's flying. "Let me go," Quinn said, simple as a sign name. "I can speak both grammars. I remember when anchors were prototypes and when lullabies were contraband." Nix did not argue immediately. She brewed tea, set it down, leaned on the console where Aloran's letter lived. "We are a republic," she said at last. "We do not nominate martyrs. We ask for volunteers and tell them the price twice." Hale told Quinn the price 3 times. The closing argument speaker might come back, but the bridge was a suggestion, not a guarantee. The seam would try to redefine witness as rumor. Modifications helped. So did stubbornness. So did being well loved by people who would demand you return. The ethics board added a 4th reading, a list of names to be filed as awaiting arrival, never lost without witness. Aloran put his hand over Quinn's consent form. "You taught me to be precise," he said. "Let me teach you to be greedy. Ask for promises we can barely keep. Make us build the bridge you deserve." Quinn signed. The planet below rang bells for an hour, not for death but for decision. Citizens lined up to donate blood and baked casseroles and mailed poems to the Basilica Network because somewhere a child had told the news. "She likes poems." The choir rehearsed, not for victory, but for fidelity. Perseverance's engineers slotted the closing argument into the array the way a locksmith fits a key he hasn't seen since his apprenticeship. The null felt the preparation, of course. It lunged at Basilica 5. Choir Group 2 held with a new harmony Thel had discovered while teaching cadets to listen for wrong commas. Soldiers do not always invent. Teachers do. The lull tightened to a hum you could feel in your rib cage and your teeth. The night before departure, Nix and Quinn walked the Long Vigil's memorial again, reconstructed from the archive into a corridor on the Concordance's civic level. Volunteers had carved the names into new plates, one letter at a time. The work would outlive them. I used to think we fought to keep a single word, Quinn said. Human. Turns out we were fighting to keep pronouns in the plural. Us, Nix said. Quinn smiled. Us. She pressed her palm to the metal where the vigil's own designation had been etched. If I don't come back, Nix's crest flashed a color that meant stop. The grammar, she warned, then softened. You are allowed to give me a job. Teach, Quinn said. Harder than you thought, kinder than you think you have time for. The closing argument launched at dawn because dawn is a human habit, and the baseliner species had decided it felt like civic courage. Ardent dawn, perseverance, and 8 choir ships burned for the seam that had started this chapter. The array brightened behind them, basilicas and bakeries and libraries humming like a city pulsing through morning traffic. At the edge, the null rose to meet them with a confidence that felt like bureaucracy, endless, patient paperwork shredding a life one clause at a time. Hale stood at Quinn's shoulder and touched the back of her hand, a human gesture that had made it through 100,000 winters. Witness, Hale said. Quinn stepped into the keystone cradle at the seam. She could feel the tug trying to unthread her childhood, to remove the taste of salt from soup, to make a lullaby just notes, not a promise. She breathed until her ribs remembered being worth filling. Commence, she said, because legal fictions appreciate punctuality. The array spoke the premises. The choir sang the lemmas. Perseverance projected the intent. We who remain define this boundary as a kindness to both sides. Quinn spoke the constant. She did not choose a speech about valor. She told a story about a mess deck mural of blue oceans and paper kites, about a sign that read, if you find this, you are home enough to rest. Then she added a clause no machine had written. We are not expelling you in anger. We are dismissing your claim because we have work to do. The null tried a last trick. It erased the word we from Quinn's throat. The choir reshaped breath into plural. It erased home. The basilica pulsed photographs of kitchens. It erased rest. The chaplain slid a loaf from the oven and broke it in half with the oldest sound in any language. Enough. The seam sealed like a scar that had finally learned its lesson. They called it a victory, then edited the headline to a boundary that holds, because Aloran had taught the newsroom to be careful with nouns. The seam did not vanish. It agreed to stay shut under a treaty the null did not sign but understood, which is as much peace as monsters and neighbors usually manage. Traffic through Aurora Gate returned with the bashfulness of people arriving late to a wedding. Basilica 3's bells rang at odd hours because children were pressing buttons with jam on their fingers and no one minded. Quinn returned. Not in triumph, not in a parade, but walking, damp with condensation, hair matted, eye dimmer than before, grin crooked. Hale hugged her the way archivists hug, with relief and inventory. Constant re-established, Hale said, voice cracking its own dignity. Next time teach a younger volunteer. Quinn laughed until she coughed. We will, after a nap. Perseverance settled into the concordance like a neighborhood school that had always been there. The cadence keepers taught classes titled History of Edges and Improvisation for Engineers. Citizens who had once scoffed at lullabies learned to keep time. The anchor accords gained footnotes, a right to return clause promising reversals where possible, an amnesty protocol offering demodification paths for soldiers who wanted to grow calluses in different places. The council passed the Charter of the 100 Names, a commitment to keep memorials public and kitchens funded, libraries open and budgets legible. Transparency, Nyx told the chamber, is just an anchor you wear on your sleeve. She took a leave from the bridge to help found the Academy of Ordinary Things, where classes taught torque and jurisprudence, bread and ballots. Her speech at opening day was short. "We saved the nouns," she said. "Now we teach the verbs." Thel married the controller who had cried over oranges on an open channel. They bought a stall by the docks and sold fruit and star maps annotated with home to someone in neat script. Moru's oven anchors became the standard for stations with more courage than metal. Aloran recovered, not perfectly but unmistakably. He paused more often before lecturing and used the pauses to let students answer each other. Precision, he wrote on the board, and mercy, and then left a blank space so somebody else could add joy. There were debates, as there should be in places worth living. Some citizens argued that the basilicas sang too loudly over the night. The chorus adjusted their schedules. Some argued the Academy's civics requirements took time from lucrative training. A baker testified about externalities with flour on her cheek. Budgets shifted. Elections turned noisy and stayed lawful. Disagreements learned to be interesting rather than terminal. Quinn went back to sea because some people are healthiest with a horizon. She kept fewer weapons on her body and more books in her cabin. On leave, she guest lectured at the Academy, using stories rather than schematics. She would stand before a room of kids who had never seen the null up close and say, "There will always be edges. Your job isn't to make them disappear. Your job is to make them honest." On the first anniversary of the closing argument, Basilica 3 hosted a concert that smelled like bread and sounded like logic holding hands with laughter. Hail began with a hymn older than any ship. A young drummer from a dust world added a syncopation nobody had planned. Quinn cried and did not pretend she wasn't. The chaplain, now head of the Academy's Department of Kitchens, served stews named after constellations. The babies whose names Aloran had used to stitch the gate toddled between tables and were handed cookies by ambassadors who had once doubted the purpose of ovens. Nyx told the story on a school stage beneath a banner of paper kites. She spoke plainly, because she had learned that plainness survives storms. "They told us the dead zones were natural," she began, and 100 small faces leaned forward. She told them about the long vigil and the day the lullaby turned an enemy into a hesitation. She told them about laws written fast and well, about a republic that burned its bridges brightly enough to show the way back. She ended, as she had to, with a kitchen. "Why music?" a child asked, voice high with serious curiosity. "Because music is math with manners," Nyx said. "Because it convinces the room to be itself. Because we were not fighting to keep guns loaded. We were fighting to keep songs singable." After the applause, after the late-night cleanup where leaders stacked chairs like citizens, Nyx walked alone to the vigil corridor. She traced a name with one finger. She whispered thanks to people she'd never meet. Then she went home to sleep and dreamed not of wounds or proofs or even bells, but of a boy on an old earth field catching a ball in a leather glove, looking up as if to say, "Hey, did you see? I did the ordinary thing well." In the morning, cargo queued at the Aurora gate. Ore, rice, wedding rings, dog-eared books. The array hummed. The Republic argued kindly. The lullabies stayed in tune. Somewhere far out where maps still guess, a seam listened and decided for now to mind itself. And in a mess deck on the ardent dawn above the coffee urn and the emergency masks, someone taped a new sign, letters blocky and hopeful. "If you find this, you are home enough to rest."